This video series focuses on the elements of design: lines, shapes, forms, spaces, textures, and color. This video focuses specifically on textures. There are 9 videos in this series. Be sure to start by watching the introduction and then come back to this video. Printable sketchbook pages are included. Start by printing this information page about texture and add it to your sketchbook. Complete all of the art exercises for texture to explore different ways that we use this element of design in artwork. Let's take a closer look at texture. We need to recognize the way that elements of design are connected to each other. Recall that a line begins with a point. Lines can describe the edges of shapes and forms. Shapes are 2-dimensional and flat. Forms are 3-dimensional and have volume. Space is the area around lines, shapes, and forms. Negative space is the outside, and positive space is the inside of shapes and forms. So lines, shapes, forms, and space need to be grouped together. We cannot think of one without thinking of the others. Textures are applied to lines, shapes, forms, and spaces. In other words, we can have a rough line or a smooth sphere, but it doesn't make sense to have a rough or a smooth. These elements of design are connected. Textures can completely change the feeling given by a work of art. Roald Dahl created this nasty character in his book by using rough lines. This drawing of Mickey Mouse has been drawn with smooth, curved lines. This character seems very happy. Likewise, we can apply different textures to shapes, forms, and spaces to achieve different feelings. In this art exercise, we will make lots of different textures with different media. Experiment with pencils, crayons, markers, oil pastels, pencil crayons, and any other media that you have on hand. Press firmly and scribble, or blend carefully. Combine different techniques and have fun. In this 2-part art exercise, we will compare the effects of smooth and rough textures. Let's take a look at how famous artists use texture in their artwork. Victor Vasarely is a famous artist. He used smooth, flat colors and precise shapes with crisp edges. This artwork looks mathematical and mechanical. Let's try it. Part 1 of this art exercise uses shapes with smooth textures like Victor Vasarely. Print the collage shapes provided. Use at least 3 different colored papers and create shapes with smooth textures. Cut out the shapes and add them to the template. Does your finished artwork look precise and mathematical like the artwork by Vasarely? Let's do part 2 of this art exercise. What would have been the effect if Victor Vasarely had used rough textures in his artwork? We will use the same template, but now we will use rough textures so that we can compare the effects. Add different colors and rough textures to the collage shapes provided. Cut out the shapes and add them to the template. Compare your collages from part 1 and part 2 of this art exercise. Which artwork looks more precise and more mathematical? Perhaps Victor Vasarely purposefully used smooth, flat colors and precise shapes with crisp edges to help emphasize the mathematical and mechanical nature of his artwork. In another 2-part art exercise, we will again compare the effects of smooth and rough textures. Let's take a look at how another famous artist used texture in his artwork. Klee is a famous artist. He used rough textures in this portrait. Although he used geometric shapes that have a somewhat mathematical feeling, the rough textures add a feeling of individuality and sensitivity that seem appropriate for a portrait. Let's try it. Part 1 of this art exercise uses shapes with rough textures like Klee. Print the 2 pages with shapes. Add texture with different media. You will need at least 4 different textures. Cut out the shapes with rough textures and add them to your portrait template. Do the rough textures in your portrait add a feeling of individuality and sensitivity like the Klee portrait? Let's do part 2 of this art exercise. What would have been the effect if Klee had used smooth textures in his artwork? We will use the same template, but now we will use smooth textures so that we can compare the effects. Print the 2 pages with shapes onto different colored paper. You will need at least 4 different colors. Cut out the shapes with smooth textures and add them to the portrait template. Compare your portraits from part 1 and part 2 of this art exercise. Which artwork looks more individual and more sensitive? Perhaps Klee purposefully used rough textures to help emphasize the individual, sensitive character of the person in his portrait. How will you use texture with purpose in your own artwork? Tell me about your artwork with texture in the comments below.